South Park has spent a fair share of its existence diving into controversial topics, and despite the fact that they've done cultural commentary on countless controversies over the years, I rarely see people talk about the time they delved into those conspiracy theories. You know the ones. Maybe that's because it was surrounded by a ridiculous Hardy Boys parody, and was maybe a bit overshadowed by the countless ways Mr. Mackey found to describe somebody pooping in a urinal, but the real motivation behind the episode was to dunk on these kinds of conspiracists, which of course led Cartman on a path to answer one question.
What really happened on 9/11, 11/11/11? What really happened on 9/11?
Hey, this video is brought to you by two things today. One is my official compilation channel, Johnny Too Cozy, where I'm re-editing tons of my old videos into themed compilations, long videos that are great for sleeping or drawing. And second, my wonderful patrons who get tons of extra content exclusive to Patreon. We're currently in the middle of season 2 of our BoJack Horseman audio commentaries. Check those out if they interest you. Thank you so much for your support. I couldn't do it without viewers like you. Mystery of the Urinal Deuce aired on October 11th, 2006 during South Park's 10th season. Honestly, season 10 is sort of an iconic season when it comes to Matt and Trey wading into controversial waters. Beginning the season killing Chef by doubling down on their Scientology bashing, continuing with the now banned Cartoon Wars episodes that attempted to show an image of Muhammad, and of course Man Bear Pig, which was wildly critical of Al Gore's climate change agenda. Honestly, across the board, season 10 really goes for it, and Mystery of the Urinal Deuce is no different. Obviously, the story begins with Mr. Mackey discovering that somebody pooped in the urinal, and Matt Stone explains in the commentary that this was something that actually happened at his elementary school.
And they brought all the boys into the gym, and they asked us who did it, and did all that thing where they tried to figure out who did it, and no one ever copped to it. And then that, of course, reminded us of 9/11 conspiracies, because they're much the same.
This is a pretty funny comment, but they actually reveal later in the commentary that the episode was initially only about 9/11 conspiracies, and they sort of tied in the Urinal Deuce storyline a bit later. The real inspiration was simply how dumbfounded they were that so many people were pushing 9/11 conspiracies.
This was our episode trying to deal with our astonishment about how people could be that dumb.
And so, as is often the case when a South Park character is taking a firm stance on something very harmful and foolish, Cartman was the one peddling these conspiracies.
Well, did you know that over 1/4 of people in America think that 9/11 was a conspiracy?
So initially, this really was just entirely about how stupid they believe 9/11 conspiracists are, and they had formed the entire episode around this premise alone. It wasn't until late into the production week that they found their missing piece.
But I remember it was Sunday that we came up with the idea of the Urinal Deuce. We're like, we gotta throw something else in here. And until then, it was actually just the Hardy Boys trying to solve the mystery of the World Trade Center, which we thought was really funny. But
they initially just wanted to sort of use this story as a buffer so that the episode didn't come right out of the gate about 9/11 conspiracies, and also to inject a bit more comedy into something that was largely focused on angry and contentious subject matter.
So we added this scene with Mackey coming in, being all pissed off about the deuce in the urinal, and we thought it was how pissed off he was so funny that it was just one of those things that, you know, a lot of times we do on a Sunday, we just grabbed onto that, and it ended up being kind of more the fuel for the show.
And so they swapped out jet fuel for Mr. Mackey, who I think can melt steel beams, and I also think that comedically this was a really fun choice. This is definitely one of the quintessential Mr. Mackey episodes.
Okay, dropping your pants and then turning around, squatting over that urinal. Okay, maybe pulling your butt cheeks apart with your hands, okay?
But there are two things acting as the sort of glue that ties these stories together. One, Cartman's obsessive conspiracy-fueled investigations, and two, the Hardy Boys, investigating both the Urinal Deuce as well as those 9/11 conspiracies.
The Hardy Boys in the case of the World Trade Center conspiracy.
The Hardy Boys angle is the most purely comedic side of the story, primarily focusing on these caricatures of your classic teenage detectives who are quote-unquote following clues.
Oh, Frank, seriously? I have such a raging clue right now. I think we better follow it.
These segments, for the most part, just kind of play this joke over and over. It is purely caricature-based comedy with the raging clue double entendre. And while it is certainly uncomfortable and awkward, definitely makes me laugh. But the other side of the story, Cartman's own investigations, are definitely what hold the bulk of the commentary here. There are a couple angles. One, the poking fun at the absurdity of some of these 9/11 conspiracies, including some of the logical fallacies that can take place when entertaining these ideas.
Oh, really? Do you just believe everything you're told, Kyle?
The implication here being that the only reason Kyle doesn't believe these conspiracies are because he quote-unquote believes everything he is told, which is obviously a severe leap in logic. I'll touch more on specific conspiracies later, but this episode really focused on how these ideas spread. We see Butters start to entertain these conspiracies himself, not because of his own research, but simply because of Cartman's influence.
The government and the corporations headed by the Jews that carried out 9/11.
That's right, Butters.
God damn it! You see what happens when you spread this stupid crap, fat ass?
And they further explore the ways these ideas can spread through the results of Cartman's quote-unquote investigations here.
Which leads us all to the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. Kyle.
Interestingly, this episode was actually originally going to include a Dog the Bounty Hunter parody where Cartman has to track Kyle down to bring him to justice for perpetrating 9/11, but once they figured out the whole urinal deuce angle, they punted this entire idea to the following episode, Miss Teacher Bangs a Boy.
The idea of Cartman being Dog the Bounty Hunter was actually in the show before that. It was actually in Mystery of the Urinal Deuce.
But obviously the assertion that Kyle is the person responsible for 9/11 is in fact completely absurd, and yet a lot of his classmates start to believe it just because of Cartman's presentation.
You gonna watch the game tonight, Butters? All right. I was not responsible for 9/11.
Rewatching Mystery of the Urinal Deuce actually made me realize that there have sort of been spiritual successors to this episode in more recent years. The different ways that conspiracies can be indoctrinated into people is explored pretty explicitly in the vaccination special, mostly focusing on QAnon, but the episode that really feels a lot like this one is season 26's Cupid Ye. That episode satirizes a lot of Kanye's Jews control the media rhetoric from when he was on that major media tour, and much like this one, the episode sort of focuses on Cartman spreading these ideas that Kyle is responsible for something that he isn't. In Cupid Ye, it's that he runs Hollywood, which leads to the kids trying to leverage Kyle's quote-unquote position for their own gain.
Because repeating a derogatory slur, even for the purpose of refuting it, can make stupid people think it's valid.
Holy shit, Kyle runs Hollywood.
This is largely the same idea being explored in Mystery of the Urinal Deuce. The idea that no matter how absurd or ridiculous, when people repeat these conspiracies, they spread. Whether they're being repeated in a genuine manner or simply to refute and belittle those ideas. And though Cupid Ye definitely makes a big point at the end of the episode to try and contextualize the inflammatory claims being made in a much more straightforward, fact-based manner, I do think that Kyle's sentiment in this episode largely represents the conclusion that Matt and Trey reached while making Mystery of the Urinal Deuce nearly 2 decades earlier.
All right, you know what? No matter what we say in this show, the people that think it's a conspiracy are still going to think it's a conspiracy, and so let's just make it about a turd in the urinal because it's just funnier.
It definitely feels like when making the episode, Matt and Trey set out to try and make a larger, unimpeachable point about 9/11 conspiracies, and sort of realized that at a certain point, people who are so deep into these conspiracy rabbit holes cannot really be reasoned with. They want to believe what they believe. And so they pivoted away from the Dog the Bounty Hunter stuff and really leaned into the conspiracy story, turning it into their own conspiracy. And to me, this is absolutely the genius of the episode. At first, taking the conspiracy all the way to the White House and revealing that Bush and the US government were in fact responsible for the 9/11 attacks.
All I had to do was have explosives planted in the base of the towers.
Then on 9/11, we pretended like 4 planes were being hijacked.
Really, we just rerouted them to Pennsylvania, then flew 2 military jets in the World Trade Center filled with more explosives and shot down all the witnesses in Flight 93 with an F-15 after blowing up the Pentagon with a cruise missile.
This justifiably sees a very funny response from Kyle, who is just shocked that this could ever be true. And the reveal later is that, of course, it wasn't true. After the Hardley boys regroup with Stan and Kyle, they reveal what they've actually learned.
The 9/11 conspiracy is a government conspiracy.
This is genuinely such a fun and smart way to escalate this kind of a plot into a bigger and more creative story. When initially starting this episode, they simply wanted to dunk on 9/11 conspiracies, which they realized was decidedly less funny. But by examining conspiracy culture and taking their characters down that road in a new way, exploring the winding turns conspiracies can take if you let them, they found a much, much funnier outcome. That Bush and the US government want people to believe that 9/11 was an inside job because that is what makes them look as though they have the most power and control.
It's all right here in these secret documents, but you'll never get them.
Ironically, I think that these days, many people would have just openly believed this idea rather than recognizing the obvious satire, simply based on the number of comments I've gotten from people who genuinely, literally believe that South Park has been directly censored by the Biden administration. As someone who is not a fan of the Biden administration, I do think it's very funny that people flip between he is completely incompetent and cannot do anything and he has complete control over what is written into adult animated cartoons. A little bit of dissonance there. But I understand when people justifiably have less and less trust in their government, it leads to these kinds of conspiracies not just taking hold, but becoming increasingly mainstream. The episode ultimately brings everything together with the reveal that it was actually Stan who pooped in the urinal, and emphatically claims that obviously terrorists perpetrated 9/11. Honestly, it's pretty interesting how South Park has tackled conspiracy culture over the years. This was, of course, 2006, just 5 years after the September 11th attacks, and 9/11 was definitely a major early example of conspiracies taking hold and spreading wildly online. I personally remember watching many videos pushing these ideas even before YouTube, and at my younger age, finding them relatively compelling, and that has clearly permeated various parts of online subculture. In fact, in a study from just last year, YouGov found that about 20% of Americans believe that the US government was behind the 9/11 attacks. That is 1 in 5 Americans, with another 14% not being sure one way or another. So that is nearly 1/3 of all Americans with at least some skepticism in regards to what actually happened.
People? You mean sheeple?
Obviously, there are many degrees of 9/11 conspiracy culture, many different flavors of theories, some that feel somewhat reasonable and some that feel absolutely batshit absurd if you just put a little bit of logic behind them.
Those clues pointed out that all the 9/11 conspiracy theories could be disproven scientifically.
You've got your "the US government knew beforehand and let it happen" conspiracists, which is a bit simpler and tougher to disprove, but then you've got your "there were no planes" conspiracists, or "explosives were planted in the tower, it was a controlled demolition, airliners couldn't take down a skyscraper" people, who are decidedly and irrefutably wrong. I mean, seriously, you can disprove this simply with any amount of research into what is required to do a controlled demolition of any size, let alone to demolish 2 of the largest buildings in the world. Seriously, just go watch any video of a controlled demolition to understand what those explosions look and sound like. Or just looking into how the Twin Towers were constructed and why this kind of collision took them out so thoroughly, or how the specific circumstance of a commercial jetliner filled to the brim with jet fuel flying full speed into a building was a completely unprecedented event, and it was never even conceived of in regards to construction of the towers. Yes, the towers were built with the idea that maybe they could withstand a jetliner impacting them, but this was when they were designed in the late 1960s, and it was conceived as an unintentional lower speed collision. A plane losing its way in the fog like when the Empire State Building was hit. Not intentionally at near 700 miles per hour speeds. That concept was not even considered. Sorry for the rant, but some of these theories are just so frustrating, and as someone who has done a lot of research into those events very thoroughly, it really sucks how many people parrot some of the most easily refutable theories. And even 18 years ago when the episode released, that was clearly what Matt and Trey were feeling as well. Just frustration that this idea was gaining any traction at all. But it's also clear that given these ideas have continued to be just as prevalent now nearly 20 years later, that they were sort of right in their initial conclusions, that people are just gonna believe this stuff if they want to. And no South Park episode or popular mechanics studies or YouTube videos are gonna deter people who really want to believe it.
Why people believe conspiracies is actually really interesting, but not as immediately funny.
Yeah.
So.
It's so obvious. How did we not see it before?
Johnny
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.